You all are in for a treat. I have the honor of introducing our keynote speaker who needs no introduction. He was a presidential candidate a couple of times. I don't know if some of you all know that. He's been a free market warrior probably all of his life. He certainly is now. And in case you all are not aware, no one is yelling in the megaphone and has a bullhorn for this movement more than Steve Forbes. Let's give him a warm welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Keith, for those very kind words. Thank you for not elaborating on what happened to those presidential campaigns, which is why we're meeting here instead of my presidential library. All could have been free. Washington pays for everything. But it is a great honor to be here, and it's an honor precisely because you're at the forefront of a very righteous and moral battle to bring free markets to healthcare. You've seen firsthand what government and the third-party system has done, and there's no point in pointing out villains or things like that. The system evolved. No one designed it, but here we are, and the question is, where do we go from here? You all know what's happened with the current system in terms of the availability of healthcare to millions of people, the quality of healthcare, the cost, and you're achieving success even as the empire is striking back. They're trying to make Obamacare subsidies bigger and more permanent. They're trying to expand Medicare, such a successful system. But what you may not fully realize is that your ultimate success is not just successful for healthcare, but also for the health of America itself, the whole soul of the nation, the health of the American experiment. You've seen firsthand what happens when that essence is attacked, and by achieving success here, you can give really support to the rest of the country as we fight this epic battle that is now underway as to what kind of nation we want to be. Where are we going? And as you know, there are forces at work that want to fundamentally change this nation. What made this nation unique was, as Abraham Lincoln put it, giving people a chance to improve their lot in life. The amazing thing is, when people come to this country, their kids are as American as anyone else. But there is a huge effort to change what made this country unique. And whether you call it socialist or something else, it's not about nationalizing things. Nationalizing things by the government is so yesterday. You don't have to nationalize. You've seen in healthcare what control does. You don't have to own it. You just have to control it and make them dependent on you. So it's not just about healthcare. It's about controlling the economy, controlling our culture, controlling more and more aspects of your personal life. You've seen it in healthcare. You've seen it in what they've done in higher education. In healthcare, you know that the system breeds passivity, dependency, and that's not the way we want for the rest of the country. You can testify to the rest of the country where this leads. And unfortunately, these forces are not interested in prosperity, but power. It's about power, not prosperity. These Biden bills that are out there, there's still a couple more to go. Numerous new entitlements, like free community college. That sounds nice. Then you realize the golden rule. He who has the gold makes the rules. What kind of courses are they going to teach at first at community colleges and then colleges? It's bad enough it's what's happening at some of our universities, what's happened to the curriculum there. Imagine AOC and Elizabeth Warren writing that curriculum. You haven't seen anything yet. It's sad. And you see the move to unionize preschool, make it mandatory, controlled by the unions. Child care, controlled by the unions. Even electric vehicles. Electric vehicles were the wave of the future. Why do they need massive government subsidies and mandates to make it work? This new infrastructure bill has billions of dollars for electric vehicle recharging stations. Now, did Washington have recharging stations for gasoline, Did they have to put subsidy to build gasoline when the automobile rose in the early part of the last century, especially in the 1920s? No. People wanted it. People did it. They didn't need it forced down their throat. Alternative energies. Again, if the technology was there, they wouldn't need the push. And hundreds of billions of dollars have been spent to push this, and the technologies I'll be discussing is obsolete and will do and is doing more harm than good. But the thing is, once you put in these entitlements, they're impossible to remove. They just grow and grow. And that's how they do, then that's why they engage in fake budgeting. For instance, the bill after this, see, Washington's already getting mad. But what you see it in this bill they're going to take up after this fake infrastructure bill. And by the way, the $1 trillion in that infrastructure bill, only about 23% could actually qualify as real infrastructure. The rest is a lot of other stuff, including the Green New Deal. But they come up with this $3.5 trillion figure, bad enough, but it's actually $6 or $7 trillion. Because they have a rule in Washington, you must score these things out for 10 years. Estimate what a program is going to cost in 10 years. So how do they know, in reality, these things are just going to balloon? So how do you make it more palatable? Well, you say, it's going to expire in 5 years. It won't, but it makes the scoring easier. 10 years of spending, but do you pretend it's only 5 years? It doesn't look so bad. It's like what they do in Medicare. They're always going to cut reimbursements, and then they never do, but they always score massive cuts. Never happens. They also want to give the IRS new powers. Now, they took it out of this bill, but that's going to come back again in the next bill when they have what they call reconciliation, where they can ram this thing through just in a straight party vote, where the IRS will not just look at your income tax returns, but look at the flow of funds into your bank accounts, into your brokerage accounts, and things like that, setting the foundation for a wealth tax. They have to see everything you own, everything you do to determine whether you qualify for a wealth tax. Hasn't passed yet, but they're starting to lay the foundations for it now. And voting, no ID, allowing harvesting of ballots where they turn in ballots, but the people who turn the ballots in, they weren't the voters. They just happened to get them from people who allegedly voted. Ripe for fraud. That's what they want. But already the administrative state has been growing for years. And you can see it in the laws that Congress passes. Congress passes about 130, 150 laws a year, maybe when they really get it up, 200 laws a year. Whereas the regulatory agencies, so-called independent regulatory agencies, pass 3,000 to 4,000 rules equivalent of federal law each year. 10 to 15 times as much as Congress. But by golly, they have the force of the federal government behind them. Some of them are absolutely absurd. A lot of you own doggies, poochies. You have those leashes, that are flexible so you don't choke the pooch. If you go on federal land and your leash at maximum is longer than 6 feet, you have violated federal law. Not supposed to exceed 6. Well, it's very important for the health of the nation that leashes not go beyond 6 feet on federal property. Absurd. But there was a book that came out about a decade ago. Title is 3 Felonies a Day. And while the book is a decade old, its purpose and the point is still valid. If you have any position of responsibility, you commit several felonies a day and you don't even know it. And that's how their power comes. They want to get you, they can. And that is something that just absolutely violates the whole essence of this nation, the rule of law, where you have clear, explicit rules and you know whether you're stepping over the line or not. And they're getting more and more petty, and have for years, in the name of saving the planet. For instance, this administration is revoking a deregulatory move by the Trump administration on shower heads. How much water pressure should come out of a shower head? Extremely important to saving the planet, shower heads. Now, the Trump administration had eased a rule. Now the Biden administration is putting it back because they don't want you to have a strong shower head. Other countries don't get hung up on it, but we do. And if a manufacturer makes a shower head that allows more water coming out than the regulators say, they've committed a crime. I know at least one couple, they just told me about it. They bought in some new shower heads and spent time, an afternoon, removing the devices inside that regulate the flow of water. I'm not going to reveal their names because they're friends. But this kind of pettiness goes to dishwashers. Why don't dishwashers work as good as they once did? Why haven't they improved and become cheaper? Precisely because in the name of saving energy, they made them utterly energy efficient, which means you end up using more energy. Same thing with washing machines, refrigerators, and even the tank on your toilet. Can't be more than 1.6 gallons. So I'm not going to go on the crappy results of that, but you get the point. You get the point. Now, ostensibly, this is supposed to save water, which we're running out of. We're not. Just take the state of California, always having droughts, always a water crisis, always telling you don't swim and all that stuff. You realize that California flushes into the Pacific Ocean an average of half of their annual rainfall. They don't put it in reservoirs. They deliberately flush it out into the Pacific Ocean, ostensibly to save, I don't know what it is, but hundreds of billions of gallons. Utterly wasteful. So there's not a shortage, but there's a shortage of as good sense in the governing of California and much of the rest of the country, and indeed the world. By contrast, you take the state of Israel. As you know, Israel's in a desert, not a lot of rainfall. When Israel was founded, the modern state in 1948, the country had then about 600,000 people. Today it's about 8 million. You realize that thanks to technology like things like desalination plants, Israel uses a little less water today, not per capita, but in total than they did 1948. Less water through sensible technology. And free stuff, who doesn't like free stuff? Who doesn't like getting swag? But in the real world, it doesn't work out that way. How are they going to pay for this? Well, ostensibly, they're going to tax the rich. People like Jeff Bezos. That's why they made sure he came back from space. They want to get their hands on that money. And so they have proposals like raising the corporate tax, business tax. Make it sound like, this is their problem when they look at it. Remember the Disney character Scrooge McDuck? Some of you, the money bin, where he sits there with piles of money and gold and jewelry. These people think that wealth is just like Scrooge's money bin. You just go in and scoop it up. They don't realize real wealth, a very small part of it is actual cash. Most of it is asset value, what something is valued. And if you create an environment where those asset values are hurt, that wealth just disappears. Poof. You slam Amazon, 100 billion, hundreds of billions, poof, goes away. Stock price goes down. They don't realize that wealth is what people are willing to pay in the marketplace. It's not having gold and jewelry and things like that. That's a small part of it. Small part of it. So they want to raise the corporate tax. That's about control. Capital gains. They want to double the capital gains tax. Put aside what that's going to do to the market. They forget. It's not just richy rich in the stock market. Over 100 million Americans have things called 401ks, IRAs, Keogh plans, pension plans, endowment plans. You slam those, you're slamming people's retirement. You're slamming museums. You're slamming a lot of things. And the thing is, they say, well, we need to raise the capital gains tax so we need more revenue. No, because we know from experience, every time you raise that tax, revenue goes down. Why? Because realizing capital gains is still a voluntary event when you want to realize it. If the rate is high, what do? You're not going to sell it, which means you freeze capital into old investments and don't let it flow into new investments. You hurt the dynamism of the marketplace. The marketplace enabling new businesses to be created and to rise up and become tomorrow's giants that we can all hate. That's the thing. You know you've achieved success in America when you become vilified. And as you know, I remember Microsoft, big villain in the 90s. We saw what happened there. Walmart, remember that was the big villain. Then Amazon came along. Suddenly Walmart became were metamorphosized from Goliath to David. So, but anyway, when you reach a certain size and you get attacked, you know you've achieved success in America. But in terms of the capital gains tax, it kills, again, the economy. And if they were really intent on raising revenue, they'd cut the tax. Every time in American history we've cut the capital gains tax, revenue's gone up because it frees that frozen capital. Realizations go up. And then they say, well, we only want to raise income taxes on the rich. Well, it's not just the rich who pay those income taxes. They don't know or ignore a thing called pass-throughs that are taxed at personal rates that are going to get slammed by that bill. Then they have step-ups. When you die, you're going to have to sell that house, sell that farm, sell that business, because suddenly you have a capital gains tax due. Little things like that. And they're also readying a tax on trusts. They're readying a tax, too, on 401ks and IRAs. When Barack Obama was president, he made noises about how no retirement fund, personal retirement fund, should have more than $2 million. And so you can see where that's going. This gets to something very important. I just want to take a moment on it. And that is the misunderstanding about profit. Profit is often portrayed as greedy capitalists taking money from workers, taking money that should go to working people and taking it for themselves. And some will say you need profit as a bribe for entrepreneurs, a little bit of a bribe for entrepreneurs. Yeah, it tells you what's working, what's not working, but in essence, it's not very moral. Actually, Joseph Schumpeter, the great Austrian economist, made the case it's just the opposite. Profit is moral, and here's why. In a dynamic economy, guess what happens? What Schumpeter called creative destruction. New things rise up, but the old goes away. You're destroying capital by that creativity. Just take newspapers. 20-some-odd years ago, the New York Times bought the Boston Globe and a few other papers in Massachusetts for $1.2 billion. Years later, they sold it for about $130 million. $1 billion, poof, gone, disappeared. Not all new businesses succeed. Most fail. So you're always in a dynamic economy, you're always destroying old capital. You have to replace the capital, but you also need it to expand and to create the new things that enable a higher standard of living. Very basic. And Schumpeter worried not about excess profit. He always worried that in a dynamic system, you have enough profit to enable this dynamism to continue and finance the future. So the real goal is control. And about that free stuff, it's not just these stupid taxes they're proposing. Look at how Europe finances its free stuff. Yeah, they have the income tax, but that's just the beginning. They have a super sales tax called the value-added tax. Now, in this country, most states have a sales tax. VAT, value-added tax, is a super sales tax, but we're accustomed 5, 6, 7, 8%. In Europe, on a national level, and what politicians love is this tax is hidden. You don't buy something in the store and they put on the sale. It's already hidden in the price. So if the price goes up, that greedy merchant, not the politicians. But anyway, the typical VAT in Europe is 20 to 25%. Now imagine a 20, 25% sales tax, what that's going to do to your standard of living. Then payroll tax in this country, called FICA, allegedly finances Social Security and Medicare. In this country, the tax is 15.3%, 2.9 for Medicare, 12.4 for Social Security. Half employer, half employee, 15.3%. You know what the typical payroll taxes are in most European countries? Between 30 and 50%. So you want to pay 3 or 4 times what you're paying in FICA now? What's that going to do to standard of living and job creation? So when you raise these taxes like that, that means less money for growth, less money for innovation, hurts the people with the least because you don't have a dynamic economy that enables people to rise up. And the thing that they always forget is that taxes are not just a means of raising revenue. Taxes are also a price and a burden. These people just assume the economy just works. Just works. Don't worry about it. You know, as kids, remember back in ancient times, they'd try to teach us about milk. You know, you go to the store, you see the milk. In those days, the milkman would deliver the milk. And they wanted to teach you that just didn't happen. So we'd go to the dairy, see the cows milked, see the cows raised, see the milk pasteurized, bottled, shipped, all the things that go into making it happen. These people assume it just shows up at the store, voila, don't worry about it. They don't realize what it takes to make things work, to make things happen. So that's why they do these crazy things. And so taxes just don't raise revenue, they're also a price and a burden. Tax you pay on incomes, the price you pay for working. Tax on capital gains, the price you pay for taking risks that work out. Profit, the price you pay for being successful. And if you raise the burden and price on productive work, risk-taking success, guess what happens? You get less of them. Now, Europe, their economies there are smaller than the US. Yet for several generations now, their average growth rate is less than that of the United States by a substantial margin. We'd think the US was such a big economy, it'd be hard to grow a lot. So big, so many old things around. Yet in Europe, we've been outpacing Europe since the 70s. Why? Because they're high taxes and their single-pay systems and the like, crushing dynamism in the economy. So in terms of taxes, less is more, which is why I like the flat tax, single-rate system. You know, in this country, as you know, if you take the federal income tax code, all the attendant rules and regulations, 10 million words and rising. And nobody knows what's in it. The IRS doesn't know. You call them up, assuming they answer it. 25, 30% of the time the answer they give you is wrong. False, but they hold you responsible for it. And so several years ago, a magazine did a survey. They took a family's finances, hypothetical finances, gave the numbers to 46 different tax preparers, people considered experts in the field. And you know what you got back. 46 different returns, 46 different estimates, thousands of dollars of difference. These from people who make the living at the thing. And don't think software is going to help you out. Depending on the brand of software you use to prepare your tax return, depending on your circumstances, you'll get different calculations of what you owe Uncle Sam. So even the software writers can't figure this thing out. It's crazy. And so if we are serious, what we do is we just junk this code and start all over again. Just throw it out. I used to say bury it, but the EPA wouldn't allow you to. It's so toxic. And just start over. Have a single rate. I had a proposal of 17%. Generous exemptions for adults and for kids. So a family of 4 would pay no federal income tax on the first $52,800 of salary and pay only 17 cents on the dollar above that. No tax on your savings. No death taxes. You should be allowed to leave the world unmolested by the IRS. As our founders would say, no taxation without respiration. And it happens. And just go back 20 years. You know, the IRS tells us we spend 6 billion hours a year filling out tax forms. Experts tell us we spend $200 to $300 billion a year complying with this monstrosity that no one understands. It's utterly corrupt, brings out the worst in everybody. Biggest source of lobbying in Washington. Go back 20 years. Imagine that 100 billion hours of filling out tax forms. Literally trillions of dollars complying with the code. Imagine if those resources had gone for new products, new services, new medical devices, new cures for diseases. How much better off we'd all be today. What economists call the opportunity cost. You see it with the tax code, you see it in healthcare. What's the latest number, Keith? 3.8 trillion? As you know, if we had a real free enterprise system, at most it would be about 1.8 trillion. Imagine what those resources, extra resources, could have gone for in terms of improving our quality of life. So they just don't stop. If they're really interested in schools and educating kids, you know, they say, we got to compete with China. Well, let's start with education. Give kids a decent education. The only way you're going to do it with the current system is put the money in the hands of the parents. Have the money follow the kids and the parents, not the school. They're called education savings accounts. West Virginia and several other states are putting it in. West Virginia starts, I think, next summer. 90% of households qualify for it. So if you don't like one school, go to another school. People's opportunities should not be defined for kids by zip codes. And you may have a good school in your area, but it may not be right for the particular needs of your kid. We're not all the same. Education savings accounts. They also want in these minimum wages and also a universal basic income. They proposed one the other day, $1,200 per person per month, $600 per kid. Do a little arithmetic. Family, 2 parents, two adults, 3 kids, $50,000 a year for not working. What do you think that's going to do in terms of blighting people, hurting the economy, and hurting people by really deadening them from developing their talents? Absolutely wrong. And then inflation. The Fed likes inflation, the Federal Reserve. They say 2% a year is good. It's like saying a little bit of pneumonia each year is good for you. It's weird. Inflation means you're lowering the value of money. Money's supposed to measure wealth, measure prices. You don't float the gallon of gasoline, do you? Fixed weights and measures in the marketplace. You wouldn't want surgeons having instruments that floated each day. None of us would be here. And so you have 60 minutes in an hour. You don't float that. Imagine if we floated the clock, put the Fed in charge of the clock. 60 minutes an hour one day, 48 the next, 80 the day after. Imagine baking a cake. It says bake the batter 30 minutes. You have to know, are those nominal minutes, inflation-adjusted minutes, New York minutes, Texas minutes, Mexican minutes? You'd have to hedge the clock each day. It's insane. Yet in terms of money, money's not wealth. Money just makes it easier for us to trade with each other. Yet they want to change the measurement, change the yardstick each day. They wonder why the economy is faltering. And what inflation does over time, we all know about the hyperinflations, like enabled the rise of Hitler in Germany, destroyed the middle class. But we're experiencing a slow motion inflation. But over time, it's just as devastating because people don't understand why they can't seem to get ahead. People don't understand why it seems that the traditional ways of getting ahead, hard work, savings, improving your skills, doesn't seem to work the way it used to. The people who have connections, cronyism, people know how to game the system, speculators get ahead, not people doing it the honest way. And it's absolutely demoralizing, absolutely demoralizing. You see it once upon a time when the dollar was fixed in value and other currencies were fixed in value, you didn't have much currency trading. It's like today, a dollar has 4 quarters. That doesn't fluctuate. That doesn't fluctuate. Now, today, each day, currency trading volume is now $5 trillion a day. Imagine all that brain power wasted on something that just should be fixed. So, in terms of what happens there, you demoralize society. As John Maynard Keynes said, not 1 in a million is going to understand what is going wrong. And that's why you have a breakdown of social trust. And I think it's part of the reason why you see all this distress and social turmoil in this country. People haven't diagnosed it. So when you hear things about that we're going to find wonderful alternatives to oil and gas, they don't like oil and gas or coal. What are they going to replace it with? They say wind and solar and batteries. Well, look at that for a moment if they're serious about it. This is why it hasn't worked. The technology's not there. They wanted to get rid of oil and gas in the next 30, 40 years. All these minerals that go into making solar panels and wind farms, you'd have to increase the amount of mining of lithium 40-fold. You'd have to rip up half the earth to do all the mining. Or take cobalt, absolutely essential. Where's cobalt? In places like Congo and Africa, where they use child labor to get it. Who refines the cobalt? Over 75% is by Chinese. We want to do more of that? And take a typical wind farm. Now, if you take a turbine powered by natural gas, it's about the size of a typical residential house. It can provide juice for 75,000 families, the size of a house. Now, a typical wind farm can provide the same amount of juice for those 75,000 households. You'd need not a turbine the size of a house, you'd need 10 square miles with 20 turbines, each taller than the Washington Monument. And to build them, you would need 50,000 tons of concrete, 30,000 tons of iron ore, 900 tons of non-recyclable plastic. That's just for, and remember, electricity is supposed to be 24/7. So with wind and solar, you need backup. And to do that, for one wind farm, you need the equivalent of 10,000 tons of Tesla-class batteries just to store and that's just for one wind farm. Multiply that by thousands, you begin to realize the insanity of what they're proposing. Nobody walks it through. And then what happens after 20 years? Solar panels, turbines, batteries, they need to be replaced. Where are you going to dump that stuff in 20 years? They never ask those questions. So you say, can these crazy things happen? Well, it's happened the equivalent in healthcare. You've seen all the distortions there. They now want to do it to the energy industry. This new infrastructure bill is loaded with stuff that just increases cronyism and the size of the administrative state. One of them is the Clean Energy Demonstration Projects Office. $21.5 billion the Energy Secretary can dole out to projects she thinks will improve energy. Politics play a role? Oh, heaven forbid. $19 billion for other energy projects. I mentioned those electric vehicle recharging stations. And then they go from there to attacking what some people call the gig economy. In other words, people working on their own, people working out of their homes, people being private contractors. 30 to 50 million in this economy. They want to unionize them, destroy them. So this is why healthcare, what you're doing, you have to push back. You have to make the case for what can happen when patients are in charge and not government and vague third parties, where when sadly, too many cases when you go to the hospital, you realize you need an advocate because you're going to fall between and it's not bad people, it's just the way the system has evolved. So if you succeed in what you're doing, this is why you got to keep fighting, try to keep yourself moralized, not demoralized, is because you'll not only set off an epic revolution in saving 18% of the economy and making it the example for the rest of the world, more healthcare, better healthcare, more innovation, less cost, but also the nation in these other attacks in other areas. Say, this is what they did, what happened in healthcare, we're bringing it back, and don't let it happen to the rest of the economy. Very, very important to have that model out there. And so that way, they won't control our free speech. They won't control our culture. They won't control your lives. They won't tell you when you can take a shower and how much water you're allowed to use. No, you'll be able to do that. So in terms of the future, it's in your hands. You got to show the way. The way you do it, example, like Keith does, Steve does, the surgery center, what all of you or others are doing in other areas. And you know we can vastly improve medical care in this country. We know we can slash costs. We know we can increase the amount and the availability of health care. And innovation, it's absolutely crucial. You know, when Europe went whole hog for single-payer systems, back in the 60s, 70s, started really after the war, World War II, Europe was once a font of new medical, not just devices, but new drugs. They had formidable companies. They still have some today. But as Europe became more socialized, the baton passed to the United States. For all the way crazy things we do here, we're far ahead of Europe in new pharmaceuticals. And Europe did it to itself by doing what these people are proposing that we do here. And the amazing breakthroughs that we're seeing that can come. Remember, when you have a socialized system, innovation goes out the window. Government can't foresee the future. They just focus to them long term is the next election. Period. And so you have exciting breakthroughs. You're all familiar with the breakthroughs that are coming in cancer care, especially lung cancer, the immunotherapies. There are tests being developed that work, that can detect cancers, various cancers, before the symptoms show up, especially important in something like lung cancer. Surgical breakthroughs, ultrasound surgery on the brain, so you don't have to go inside the head. There's now surgery now that can, for many people, cure the tremors from Parkinson's. Now, the FDA has thrown up a lot of obstacles, very hard to get permission to do it. They're only about 60,000 a year, but it's had huge success. Imagine one of the most debilitating thing about Parkinson's, where they've made no progress virtually for decades. Imagine the quality of life that can improve if those tremors go away. And so these promising things are out there. Dementia. I know there's a new dementia drug. Don't think it's going to go too far. But anyway, imagine for 100 years, research was always focused on plaques and tangles. When Dr. Alzheimer did that famous autopsy of the brain of that woman, found those plaques and tangles. And so for 100 years, researchers thought, if we get rid of the plaques and tangles, we can cure Alzheimer's, not recognizing perhaps those plaques and tangles are a result of the disease, that there are other causes. And maybe it's genetic, maybe there are various ways you can stimulate the brain. Promising things are coming. Imagine getting rid of the fear of dementia. Unbelievable. But all of these things, imagine being able to replace, and some progress is being made here, being able to replace hearts, lungs, kidneys, as you would a tire on a car. Being able to manufacture these things. Research is being done in that area. Or being able to regenerate bones very easily, make them even stronger by putting certain lotions on them. Seemingly magical stuff, but it's in the works. It's in the works. So more care, cheaper care. That's what free markets are all about. And today's system, again, nobody designed it, but where the patient fits in this system today. The worst hotels in America wouldn't dare put you in a room with another guest, a sick guest. And yet still many hospitals today, maybe I can get a private room. Like this is 21st century. A single room, like it's a big deal. Kids have their own palaces now, some houses. Can't seem to do it at a hospital. And you see it with the robes. I was in one the other day. No spa would design a robe like that. We need a manual. Do you put it behind you, in front of you, under you, over you? I mean, it's come on. That's because the patient isn't in charge. The horrors about infections. Now, there's new software that helps detect sepsis early, but I guarantee you, if hospitals had to post each month online, not bury it somewhere in a bureaucracy, but post it online, how many people die of infections in that place? Now, we know when you go to the hospital, you're susceptible. We all get that. We also know there are tens of thousands of people who shouldn't be dying from infections. I guarantee if that's posted, guess what's going to happen? Entrepreneurs are going to figure out fast how to change those numbers and how to make sure those things don't happen, or certainly sharply reduce them. And we saw, too, this belief in expertise. One of the things that came out of COVID was, I hope, undermining the belief that experts should be believed no matter what, worshiped them as gods. The CDC and the WHO were in the business of tracking potential epidemics, pandemics, and we saw how they let us down. Confusing still today. Do I wear a mask? Not wear a mask? What? It changes every day. There's a wonderful 2.5-minute video online of Dr. Fauci, going back to March of 2020. 2.5 minutes, all the different statements he's made about masks. I mean, you wonder, get dizzy looking at the thing. And so, faith has been undermined, and we should use that to our advantage, that science is not fixed. Matt Ridley had a great piece the other day. He wrote a great book on innovation, pointed out that science is really two parts. One is institutional, and one is philosophy. The science of philosophy of science, is always looking, always searching, realizing you always have to question, keep advancing. And the establishment of science is what we saw here. The science. It is fixed. We'll burn you at the stake if you don't get it right. They may be always wrong, like where this virus came from. I think the evidence is there. It came out of a lab in Wuhan, not deliberately, but the procedures they had there were pretty sloppy. So it was an accident waiting to happen. And yet for over a year, you mentioned that online, by golly, they were censored by Google and others. Can't have this stuff out there. You mislead people. No, science is about constantly questioning, debating what is right, what works, what doesn't work, and it changes. You make progress. Some that worked in the past may not work anymore. And the thing is, you see it in medicine. My favorite story is ulcers. I'm old enough to remember ulcers supposedly came from smoking and anxiety. And to cure it, you had these drugs, and you also had to drink, watered down milk and crackers that you wouldn't feed your parrot, and things that wouldn't disturb the system. And then a couple of Australians said, use antibiotics. You can cure most of those ulcers. They were pilloried. They never would have seen the light of day in the environment we have now. And they were shunned and everything. You all know. One of them even gave himself an ulcer to show that the antibiotic worked. Wouldn't be able to do that today in the science environment. You all know eventually they won the Nobel Prize in medicine. But you have to have that environment where those who are on the outliers. Most of them deserve to be. But that's how you get the breakthroughs. Like you get breakthroughs in anything else. Constant innovation, constant experimentation. So we have to lay to rest the myth that there's the expert forever, that the government is an innovator. It isn't, can't be. They can't see the future any more than we can. So some basic research, not applied research. Business does that pretty well. Basic research, yeah, maybe some useful stuff comes out of that. That's about it. That's about it. So I mentioned what happened to Europe. Or take this country in the Defense Department. Why is EROM's law operating in the Defense Department? EROM is more spelled backwards. Why it takes longer and longer to develop weapon systems, years and years and years, instead of doing it as you would in the private sector every few months, every few years, boom, 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 get something new and better. Why, if a defense secretary needs a weapon systems right away, they do what they call the skunk works. They pull it out of the procurement system, give it to a company and say, here's what we want, go do it. And they'll get it done in months instead of years and years and years. That's a bureaucracy at work. Bureaucracies always become ingrown. Virtue of free markets is that if you become too ingrown, you're going to get caught out. People aren't going to use you. And that's the problem with healthcare. We don't have that kind of constant feedback. So things that, like telemedicine, great new stuff. Well, grandpa and grandma have been Skyping with their kids, FaceTiming with their grandkids for years. Why did it take so long to come to healthcare? Because there's just no incentive to do it. You didn't have that kind of free market. That's the kind of information we have to get out there. And then you look at the tests that they did at the CDC, delaying the testing in early 2020 in the FDA. So we got to get it. They're not the right ones. That's why we have to highlight things like what Keith and Steve do at the surgery center. And I think it's going to happen because most employers now are using high deductible plans. This becomes so expensive. Now, high deductible, yeah, the insurance is cheaper, but it means people are paying more out of pocket, and a lot of them can't afford it. So we should be pushing for a system like this. What's, Keith, the typical annual insurance policy, health insurance policy? I know it varies around the country. For a family, $20,000 bucks. Now imagine if you told a family, we'll give you the $20,000 in cash, and you spend it. You know what most of them would do? They'd buy that high deductible policy, and take the other 15 or 14 or 13,000, set some aside in case the kid needs a filling or something. And that's why cash wages haven't gone up very much, because it's been sucked up by insurance. Free those resources, and people end up getting more for less and a happier population. So the key thing is and then look at Singapore. You all know the story of Singapore. Very advanced country, higher standard of living, very high standard of living, higher longevity than the United States. It wasn't always that way. And their healthcare system is universal. And what's their cost of GDP? About 70% less than the United States. Why? How do they do it? Not price controls, the way most systems work in other countries. They do it by having the patient be in charge. Now, they tax you, they take certain money out of your salary, put it in the equivalent of medical savings accounts and the like, but you determine where the money goes. So hospitals compete for your business, doctors compete for your business. So you get competition. So the subsidies they give to cover people who can't afford it, the prices are set in the free marketplace. So the subsidies don't cost that much because you don't have this top-down system where CMS issues 11,000 regs each year, trying to control this thing from the top like whack-a-mole under steroids. Singapore, they let the free market do it. Now, in this country, perhaps the way to do it would be on Medicaid. Say, states, here's the money. Try the Singapore system on a state level and see how it works. I guarantee you, again, better outcomes, lower costs, more health care. So the thing is, the administration's going to be fighting this. They're going to be trying to make sure that this doesn't happen. And you know the false arguments that say, well, how can you negotiate a price when you're going to the emergency room? The answer is, you don't. Just you don't negotiate a homeowner's insurance policy when your house is on fire. You buy it in advance. But they try to tell us that, oh, healthcare is different. This goes back to the 60s. I don't know others. They try to tell us, yes, it's different. Every industry and every service is different. But the principles of free markets do work. And the idea that, oh, if you have free markets, you don't have safety nets. No, with a vibrant free market, you have more effective safety nets, more sweeping safety nets, because you're creating more wealth, more resources, more productivity, get more innovation. And so in closing, remember a few things. George Gilder and Tom Sowell and others ask a very provocative question. What is the difference between us today and people in the Stone Age? Same human bodies, same planet, same resources, same appetites. The difference between us and them is knowledge. We know more. It's simple as that. We know more. So even if you get a war, natural disaster, knowledge is not destroyed. You can rebuild and move forward. You saw that dramatically after World War II. Devastation, Western Europe, Japan. Tens of millions of people killed. Young people, flower of the future. Massive physical destruction. Experts thought it would be decades to recover. But within a few years, they exceeded pre-war levels of production. One, they felt secure because the U.S. was protecting them, but key thing is knowledge was not destroyed, so you could rebuild and then move forward. I mentioned Israel. Water, they should be in perpetual crisis. No, allowing innovation, knowledge. And knowledge comes first by not forgetting what we already have learned, which is why you have schools. We used to. And why? And experimentation. Constantly in the marketplace, in the laboratory. What works, what doesn't work. Most things are failed, but that's how you learn. And even when things fail, you learn. Back in the late 80s, early 90s, Apple had a device called the Newton, put together by people whose IQs would boil water. Flopped in the marketplace. But it had a technology that laid the basis for other Apple products that made it a mighty company. So even in failure, you can set the basis for future success. And this is another thing to remember, is the importance of the brain, which is why what we're doing in education is such a crime. You take a natural resource like oil. Oil is glop. If you think about it, it's not even really a natural resource. You can't eat it, you can't drink it, you can't feed it to camels or animals. What made this goo indispensable was human ingenuity. Human ingenuity. Another thing to remember is, as you know, in free markets, when they're allowed to operate, always turn scarcity into abundance. Always. Take the automobile 120 years ago, car cost the equivalent of $110,000. Along comes Henry Ford, moving assembly line, turns a toy for the rich into something every working person could afford. Handhelds. First one came from Motorola in the early 1980s. Big as a shoebox, weighed like a brick. Battery life, 1 hour. Price, $3,995, and voice was all it could do. Today, you have a supercomputer. If you'd said 20 years ago, Grandma could learn to use a supercomputer, which was then the size of this room, you got some very strange looks. But no. Technology, innovation, now we take it for granted, these things. I'm old enough to remember card catalogs in libraries. Had to look something up. Now it's just boom, in the hands. It's amazing how quickly we get spoiled by these things. You place a call to Outer Mongolia. It takes more than 5 seconds. You say, what a piece of crap this device is. Why is it taking so long? I'm so spoiled. Get so used to it. And so that's in vivid contrast to the kind of fake pricing we have in healthcare, as you know. I love the story I met a fellow in New Hampshire several years ago. He told the story he had a heart condition, so he goes to the heart cardiologist. One of the things the cardiologist recommends is what they call a nuclear stress test. And so the patient asks in all ignorance, he says, well, how much does it cost? Doc says, I have no idea. Insurance will probably cover it. Just do it. This guy, being an entrepreneur and therefore not accepting things as they are, went out, got teams together, and pried the prices out of about 25 different clinics and hospitals in the New England region. Test is done the same everywhere. The prices range from $1,450 to $7,350. Kind of thing, that's why you need transparency. And even though there are certain institutions that will resist pricing transparency, the more people hear about it, the more they're going to demand it. And with these higher deductibles, the more it's going to happen. And you can see, too, in terms of innovation, turning scarcity into abundance, Richard Branson and others are going up in space now. Branson's got this flying space thing. And hundreds of thousands of dollars. Eventually, they're going to develop the technology, which has been in abeyance in this country on the supersonic side, where they can shoot the plane up. You can get to Tokyo from New York in 2 hours and do so at a low price. I hope I live long enough to see it, but that's what it looks like these billionaires are playing around. No, they're setting the stage for some very serious stuff in the future. It looks frivolous at first, exotic at first. What do we need this for? Other than TV and making jokes about the look of a certain person's rocket. And so we cannot be bashful too, even if you don't like the word, of defending capitalism or free markets. How do you succeed in a free market? You do it by meeting the needs and wants of other people. Even if you're selfish, even if you love money, you're not going to get it unless you provide something that somebody else wants. You each get something from the transaction. And contrary to a myth, it enhances humanity. You may not love your neighbor, but you sure want to sell to your neighbor. You should try to figure out, how do I appeal to sell this product or service? It makes you more attuned to the needs of other people. Sometimes, Steve Jobs once was famously asked, do you do marketing surveys? And he said, no, because people don't know what they want until I show them. No lack of self-esteem there, but he was making a very valid point on what entrepreneurship is about, putting something out there. You have no idea whether it's going to work, but you're making that offering and hoping they do. You do well, good, because the rest of us are going to do well as well. So the other thing in closing to keep in mind is that these great advances come from the most unlikely sources. Just one little story, whooping cough. Decades ago, the biggest killer of kids, thousands a year. Then 2 people involved in biology, bacteriology, 2 women, Grace Eldering and Pearl Kendrick, out in Michigan, first devised a test in the 30s to find if the whooping cough was in kids before the usual symptoms showed. And then they spent 4 years devising a vaccine, and they succeeded. And the thing is, that's why you need a free market and openness. It doesn't mean it's always going to succeed. And so they're slow taking off this vaccine. So one of them decided to write to Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady, say, why don't you come out and see the great thing we're doing in a lab on whooping cough? And amazingly, Eleanor Roosevelt, whatever you think of her, came out there. The government got involved and eventually said, we should do this. Whooping cough went. Never made money on it, didn't want to, shunned the press. The 2 women decided to do something on whooping cough and did it. Succeeded in the most unlikely way. And those kind of stories repeat themselves again and again and again. That's what we have to make possible. So bottom line, your success is not only success for this industry, but also success for the United States of America. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we're going to...
So he not only has graciously agreed, to speak to us today, he's really graciously agreed to take a few questions. And I'm going to moderate questions, no speeches. Everybody get that? Okay. Who wants to go first? Yes.
Where did the idea for the Forbes 400 come from?
Very important question. Where did the idea from the Forbes 400 come from, which is what we call our rich list, 400 richest Americans, and really was the progenitor of all the lists that we do and everyone does now in every facet of life, culture, business, and whatever. So it was really important for us. It came in the early 1980s. It was my father's idea because he was wondering who had the real wealth in this country. And he picked the 400 because back in the late 1890s, the Astors, she was a big social factotum, she and a fellow named Bellamy, and they came up with the 400 social people you'd want to a party. So that's how my father just picked up 400. That sounds nice. Let's go with the 400. The editorial department at Forbes fiercely resisted it. Said, one thing if it's a public company, but a lot of this wealth is private. This is stupid. You can't do it. Criminals will love it. Fundraisers will love it. It's just not going to work. So finally, after a long period of fierce resistance, my father then said to the editors, they said, okay, I'm taking it away from the department and I'm going to do it myself. And we'll publish it since I own the place. And so they said, oh, okay. They went and they found out that by talking to competitors, talking to various banks and like, you can start to get some idea of what people have. Not precise, but in a way in which quite surprising. So it's been a mainstay ever since. And most people don't want to be on the list, at least publicly, but some do. And you can guess one who wanted to be on it and always thought we underestimated his wealth. Former president. And twice a year, like clockwork, we'd get a call. One in the spring when we did the Global Billionaires, and one in the fall when we did the 400. And the conversation for decades was always the same. You people don't get it. I've given you proof, blah, blah, blah. So if we said $1 billion, he said 2. If we said 2, it was 4. If we said 4, it was 40. Never could get it right. So, sometimes you get some unusual reactions. We got a call from one guy screaming at us. And it wasn't that he disputed the estimate, it was that he was in the midst of a divorce and his wife didn't know how much he had.
Yes.
What would it take to get you to run in 2024?
You'd have to go over my family. Forget it. I've tried it twice, so I'm an agitator now. And
Yes.
so, yeah, I'll be agitating. But the running part I'll leave to others. Get my exercise now on stationary bikes.
Do you have any advice that I can give my father-in-law who thinks this country's just too far gone and he's just like super negative about the direction we're going?
If it's any consolation, we've had some bad periods before. Now, this is a unique period. That's what makes it scary. But the thing is, and it's human nature, we always think the problems we face are unusual because we don't know how it's going to turn out. When you look at the past, you know what the story is. You know how it turns out. We don't know how this is going to turn out. So that increases the anxiety. A lot of it's unusual. Came out of the rise of social media. By the way, Matt Ridley, I mentioned him before, his great book on innovation, makes the point that sometimes these great innovative advances have their downside. The invention of the printing press, which led to proliferation of books and pamphlets in the 1500s. Who was the biggest user of it at first? Martin Luther. Set off a revolution, led to ultimately the terrible religious wars. Now, it doesn't mean we should go down on knowledge, but the technology is neutral. That's why you need a moral basis, because it can be misused. The rise of radio, which we think today is no big deal at all. We don't even think about it. 120 years ago, the idea that you could send first signals through the air like Marconi wasn't voice, but that you could send something, just throw it in the air in effect and have it go someplace and know where it went. The idea you could do that with voice was absolutely regarded as a miracle. And there's Westinghouse first station in Pittsburgh. They didn't even know what to do. It would be a community bulletin board. What do we do with this thing? Well, we soon saw programming and the like. Radio was the big high-tech thing in the 20s. But radio also enabled the rise of the dictators, the rise of mass propaganda in a way that had never been done before. We saw that in the 30s. So these things can these things can have downside, which is precisely why you have to have that strong sense of what's right and what's wrong. And in terms of some of the challenges we face are unique. You know, before the rise of the internet and social media, if you wanted to complain about something, what would you do? You might go on the phone, you might call a meeting, you might write letters to the editor, and that was it. Now everyone has a megaphone, and it's deafening and doesn't bring out the best in certain people. So that is a challenge. But then you figure out in a free society, how do you respond to it? And that is why governments that rely on top-down economics, like China's starting to do now with Xi Jinping, it can be done from the top, we can guide it, ultimately will fail. Because while we may flounder for a while, that's how you figure out what works, what doesn't work. It only comes from people constantly trying to figure out how this thing works. So in terms of the U.S., we're fighting back. I mean, look what Keith did. And you have to make the case. And sadly, the Republican Party, which is known as the stupid party, and they keep reconfirming it as they're doing it on this infrastructure bill. But you have to keep fighting. But eventually we do. In the 30s, go back to the 1890s. Go back to the 1890s, a period of great anxiety in this country, probably as high as it is today. Why? Because we always thought of ourselves as a nation of small manufacturers, tradesmen, people operating a small forge, farms. And along came these massive new corporations. And people felt they were losing control. Massive rise of cities, enormous immigration, far higher than what we're experiencing today. Could we absorb all of these people? Would they adopt the American culture? And so in the 1890s, it was compounded by a severe economic downturn. So you had strikes, violent strikes, people being killed. You had a huge surge of a farmers' revolt. They wanted a massive depreciation of the dollar to get over their distress, which came from overproduction. They were, everyone, it was much easier to grow stuff than it was before. And we did a bout of a little bit of imperialism, Spanish-American War of 1898 took over the Philippines after a 3-year war that nobody remembers today, but we lost as many people in that war between 1899 and 1902 as we lost in Iraq. Nobody remembers it today. And so huge anxiety, but we came out of it. We had the antitrust movement, at least establishing that everyone is accountable to somebody. We learned that and the big thing that set people off was the closing of the frontier. A fellow named Frederick Jackson Turner in Wisconsin, University of Wisconsin, noticed a bulletin from the Census Bureau that with the 1890 census, the American frontier was closed. That is, the open land, there was enough settlement, so you couldn't call it frontier anymore. And people thought, by golly, what made America unique was the frontier, because you could always go to something new. With the frontier at a close, are we just going to become a nation like any other nation? So enormous anxiety. Well, we got through it. We realized the real frontier is up here, not space out west. So we got through it. Another period was the 1930s. Terrible time. I mean, we had a period in 1930, the Depression, 33 to 35, what they call the National Recovery Administration, where until the Supreme Court threw it out, we had a system in place where businesses come together, set prices, set wages, and if you violated those prices, you went to jail. You were arrested. And everyone had to show they're cooperating with what they call the Blue Eagle. You put that on your business. If you didn't have it, you were in trouble. It was a pattern after what Mussolini did in Italy. Nobody tells you that in the history books anymore. But the Supreme Court threw it out. So we've had some pretty dicey periods. The 1970s was a pretty bad decade. Even if some of you were born then, you were the good part. But in the 70s, we had malaise, seemingly unconquerable inflation. Just it kept coming back and back. America was seen as a nation in decline. The Soviet Union was seen as on the march, which is why they went into Afghanistan in 1979. And we're supposedly running out of oil, running out of energy. So Jimmy Carter set up the Synfuels Corporation to make synthetic oil because we're running out of this stuff. It was all government policy error. In the 80s, we reversed that. Suddenly, Silicon Valley became a byword around the world, cutting-edge technology. So it seems every couple of generations we mess up again, or things come along we don't know how to handle it. So tell your father-in-law, you can take comfort from the history. We've been here before, very different circumstances, different times. That's what innovation does. You know, the problems are not always the same. You have to use the brain. There's no playbook. But if you don't have faith in yourself, the game is over. But if you have faith that we'll find our way through it, just as we did in the 1890s, the 1930s, 1970s, we'll do it again. That's what you're here about. You don't have to accept this system where things just go up and up and up. And the cares, you get great innovation, but it just doesn't seem to take off and just doesn't seem to work the way it should. And so you do something about it. In closing on that, Tocqueville, French aristocrat, as you know, visited this country in the 1830s, wrote a book called American Democracy. And one of the things that he marveled at, he'd never seen it in Europe, was what he called voluntary associations, people voluntarily coming together, whether it's for a problem, whether it was for sports, whether it was for professional reasons. Americans were joiners, and he said that's how citizens learn to become citizens of a republic. It's not just the family or the community. You engage in other things. And you think about all the organizations out there that we've become part of. And what you're doing here is simply what Tocqueville saw. In Europe, you asked permission. In Europe, you waited to be told. Here, we just did it. And if we have that just do it spirit, we'll get through it. And then 20 or 30 years from now, kids and grandkids will say, well, they had it sort of easy, but boy, by golly, it is terrible what we have today.
Yes, right here.
Speaking about what is your personal thought about what the ultimate first really negative repercussion of the ever-increasing national debt will be? We continue to get worse and worse and worse, but we haven't had a practical repercussion from it. Eventually, that has to happen. So when it is, what do you think it will be? And in your own estimation, how quickly are we likely to see it?
Well, trying to time these things is impossible because it's impossible to know how policymakers are going to react. The crisis of 2008 could have been easily prevented, and who could have foreseen that the government would make the mistakes it made that turned the housing crisis into something that nearly gave the financial system cardiac arrest, which would imagine all your money funds disappearing. Bad stuff. So, but in terms of what they're doing now, and it reflects this new thing called modern monetary theory, which is saying you can print a lot of money without consequences. They say it's more sophisticated than that, and I've read some books, so yeah, it is more, but it's in essence, it's these age-old things, something for nothing. So they feel they can print a lot of money, and they can always find ways and devices of putting off reckoning with what they're doing. For example, this year, the banks are loaded with cash. All their capital requirements are met. And normally with that and the money printing by the Fed, you'd think, by golly, we're going to be in for some bad inflation. It's being postponed short term. They keep coming up with these expedients by a thing called repurchase agreements, reverse repos for short. And what a reverse repo in essence is, I know this is not the legal definition, in essence is that the Fed borrows from a bank and uses Treasury securities as collateral, short term. Several months ago, the Fed had 0 reverse repos on its books. I just saw some numbers this morning, and now it's almost $1 trillion. What the Fed is doing when they buy these bonds, that's how they create money. You have to understand how they create money. When the Fed wants to create money, it calls up, say, Goldman Sachs and says, we're going to buy from you, give us a bid for $1 billion of bonds. So Goldman sells them $1 billion. How does the Fed pay for the $1 billion of bonds? They wire the money to Goldman's account. Where does the money come from? Out of thin air. Fed just says the bank, do it, hold them at ATM. There it is, $1 billion. When they want to reduce the supply, they'll call up in Goldman and say, we want to sell $1 billion. So Goldman says, fine, we'll buy the $1 billion. Goldman wires the money to the Fed, and where does the money go? In essence, into the ether, pulled out of the system, neutralized. So what the Fed has been doing, it's been buying about 120 billion of bonds a month, 80 billion treasuries, 40 billion mortgage-backed securities. And this is in a system that's already flooded with cash because of the bills they passed and what they were doing before COVID. But now they have this device called reverse repos that they're using. So in effect, it's like the equivalent of taking a bucket of water and pouring it in one end of a pool and going to the other end and taking a bucket of water out, in and out. So the Fed pours the money in and then uses reverse repos, short-term debt. In effect, I know that's not the legal definition, but a debt, and pull it out. How long they can go doing gimmicks like that, I don't know. But so they can put it off. But the thing is, even if they keep putting off a big crash, you can do a lot of damage slowly, short term, like this slow motion inflation we've been having for decades. Little bit, but by golly, it accumulates. So, and it's not just the debt per se. It's the fact that debt is increasing. If they just stop doing this nonsense, we could grow our way out of it. Just after World War II, we had debt a little higher than what we have today. That happens after a war where you save civilization, not cheap. And so if you want the number, I think it was about 121, 122% of GDP. The debt, national debt after the war was equivalent to about 122% of the size of our economy. By the late 60s, before we started to play games again, got down to about 35% by just a little bit of prudence on the national level. Let growth do it. You know, as you know, if you have a liability and if the asset side is growing fast, the liability becomes less oppressive. But the danger we're doing is we're increasing the liabilities and at the same time hurting the economy. You want to help the economy, not hurt it. So when a company has a lot of debt, it doesn't try to put itself in do things that hurt their sales and put the company out of business. Governments don't go out of business. They just don't. They just let the inflation do away with the debt, or they just default on it. So it's not the size per se. It's the fact they don't realize that you can't keep going on creating this stuff out of thin air. Something will happen. Could be China attacks Taiwan. It could be someday somebody just loses faith in the market and they can't sell the bonds anymore. You don't know what will precipitate it, but they're playing with fire. And I wish, that's why I hope we stop these spending bills. And if the Fed knew what it was doing, it could work its way down from what it's done, if it knows what it's doing. But when they keep saying they like inflation, I don't like sickness. So I worry. That's why I always buy a little bit of gold. Not a lot. Gold is like an insurance policy. For a variety of reasons, it keeps its intrinsic value. But it's not an investment. It's an insurance policy. And so I hope it's like your homeowners. You hope you never use it. I hope the gold's never necessary. But how long the Fed can play these games? That's why, again, in closing, watch those spending bills. If they get through, 6, 7 trillion, and the key thing is not just the size, it's the new programs they put in that you can't control anymore, or won't be able to control without a severe crisis. That's what you want to keep out. I could take a big spending bill if they don't put those permanent entitlements in, because I know in future years, if we get our act together, we can work our way out of it. But it's these other things that make it difficult to reform. That's when you get a real problem. And eventually interest rates will go up, and that means with that debt, you're going to have the biggest item in the budget's going to be interest on the national debt. And right now, it's less today, about the same size today as it was when the debt was half the size because of the suppression of interest rates. Can't go on forever. And the sooner we realize that and take corrective measures, the less easy it's going to be. So I hope we don't have a big crisis, but hopefully in 2022 and 2024, we get people in who realize you work on this and we can work our way out of it.
Let's give him a big hand.
Thank you. Thank you.